And so my first day, they literally sat me down and said, all right, label all these bottles. It was like 1,300 bottles. So I labeled all those by myself. And I guess they figured, all right, well, if you do that and he doesn't mess it up, and if he wants to come back the next day, then we'll see what happens.
I'm your host, Brian McCann, and this is the Road to Wine Expert podcast. So how do you go from labeling 1,300 bottles of wine to hosting your own podcast? Chappy Cottrell is the man behind the mic at Cru Podcast, and listening to Chappy's interviews was a source of inspiration for the Road to Wine Expert Summit. After all, here was someone seeking out wine stories of industry folk, just like I wanted to do. Chappy is actually someone I got to meet in real life when I made my first trip out to Sonoma, California in July of 2018. We got coffee, caught up, he shared a little vino with me. It was a great time. And it was nice to find out he has continued his success with his podcast and his wine career. But let's take a step back before we go forward and hear how Chappy got started in the wine industry.
I guess I've always had a love-hate relationship with wine, you could say. So I grew up in Florida, and I guess really my intro to wine was my stepmom used to work for a high-powered attorney in Manhattan, and she really loved wine. Like she still has a big private cellar in her apartment, and has a locker at Sherry Lehman in Manhattan, and so she would send us, 2-3 bottles of nice Bordeaux, Saint Emilion, something like that, for Christmas. And this is when I was in middle school, high school, and she still does a bit today. And so that kind of was my maybe not formative, but my intro to wine. Didn't know what it was. I just knew it was something that adults drink and they like it. And so I'll drink it too. And this is what I'm supposed to be doing. But I knew it was nice because my parents, whenever we would open one of those bottles, they would get out the, Waterford crystal glasses, and it would be kind of this experience. So that was kind of my intro. And from there, I didn't really know what to do in high school, as we all do. Tried a bit, experimented and all that. But really, my parents are British. And so I grew up with the understanding that, you respect alcohol and drink, and, it's a part of your culture. It's something you have at the table with the family, and you enjoy it that way. So, in high school, I would have a glass of wine with dinner on a Friday night with the family. And I think that really got the wheels turning, because I knew, all right, well, this is something that is interesting, but I didn't know what it was or anything else. And so when I went to college, that kind of turned me on to wine a bit more. I think at that point in time, my freshman year of college, I wanted to be a farmer for some reason. I had never farmed ever. Grew up literally a block away from the beach in Florida. Like, farming was like another world. But for some reason, I was drawn to it. And there was a winery not down the street, a few miles away from the university that I went to. And I basically called them up and said, are you looking for an intern? I'd love to come work for free. And so it was a small vineyard winery. And that kind of really took it off from there. So, yeah.
That's pretty fascinating. I like the idea of Florida beach kid grows up and wants to be a farmer. I like that, that angle of the story.
Yeah.
So started working. Can you talk a little bit more about your first experience in wine and what you did at the winery as an intern?
Yeah. So like I said, I just reached out to them, said, hey, can I come work for free? Basically, they said, yeah, come on. Why not? And I didn't know what I was getting myself into at all. Again, didn't really know much about wine. And so I think as a test, the first day I showed up and I walk into the winery, and granted, it's a really small winery, family owned. I walk in and there's a card table set up, and on one side there's a bunch of empty pallets. The other side, there's a bunch of full pallets. with unlabeled bottles. And so my first day, they literally sat me down and said, all right, label all these bottles. It was like 1,300 bottles. So I labeled all those by myself. And I guess they figured, all right, well, if you do that and he, doesn't mess it up, and if he wants to come back the next day, then we'll see what happens. So lo and behold, I enjoyed it. Somehow masochistically enjoyed it. And I came back the next day, and it just kept going from there. And it was everything from labeling bottles to harvesting in the vineyard, picking grapes to, whatever else, just enjoying the view, to cleaning tanks. The mountains in North Carolina in harvest are very cold. It's snowing outside. And it's a small winery, so the facility isn't large. So we are cleaning tanks with sulfur outside in November at 5 a.m. So it's, 5 degrees or whatever, and you're soaking wet. But for some reason, I loved it. So I don't know why, but I did. And just kept on growing from there.
So I got a couple ways I want to go with this. Let's start with your, just that you loved it. That aspect of it, from everything from labeling bottles to, being wet and cold and outside in, freezing weather. What do you think? Was it something that was so foreign to you that attracted you to it? Was it something, did you have any sort of experience? Did you work any other jobs prior to that, like retail or anything, where you had any connection to sort of the monotony of maybe some physical labor or things like that?
Yeah. So in, I guess, middle school, high school, I worked at a lot of restaurants. Okay. So my first job was 14, running food from the kitchen to the table in a little seafood restaurant in Florida. And that was obviously, manual labor, which was great. And then I went on to a 4 and 5 diamond resort right on the beach. That was really nice. Again, waiting tables, doing various things. But I remember there's always, every time I would go out to dinner or lunch or something with my family, I would always look at the wine list, even though I had no idea what I was looking at, no idea what any of it meant. Or I would stare at the bar and just stare at the bottles. For some reason, it just piqued my interest. Not necessarily what the label said, but what was in it. I wanted to know what that was. But then also I think the aspect of, wow, I can look at this label, or I can look at this tap handle of a craft beer, and I see that, I see the name, I see the art, and I associate that with, okay, that's this brewery over here, that's this distillery over here, that's this person doing this, and this is their story, and it all started to connect. And so I think that was part of the reason why I loved it, is because, all right, I understood all this and the backstory and everything else, but I didn't understand how that got to that point. So how did that bottle of wine get from, our storage closet downstairs at this hotel to the person's glass? Well, how did it get to the storage closet? What was that? And I was at a nice 4 and 5 diamond resort, and so it was nicer wines. Nothing fancy, but it was a Wente Chardonnay. It was a house wine, and Chateau Saint Michel, and wines like that. So there were nicer wines on the market. And so that, I think that piqued my interest as well. And I would just stare at those bottles while I was working, while there was nothing to do, waiting tables, and I would read the labels and all this stuff. And I think I just wanted to see where it came from.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that bottle fascination, because I you recharged my memory, and I remember being a kid. I was probably 12, 13. And never had alcohol before in my life, but I was obsessed with martinis for some reason. And I remember I had martini books now, and I had martini shakers, and I had all this stuff, and I could have told you how to make a martini.
Wow. At 12 years old.
Yeah. And what a bizarre thing for a 12-year-old to be into. And it was, my parents didn't even drink them. It wasn't like I was the kid in the Bad News Bears who was making a martini for his dad. So it's funny you mentioned that. So maybe I have some like weird.
Been watching James Bond too much.
Yeah, deep fascination with alcohol that I need to like get a Freudian psychologist to come look at everything and figure out if I'm okay. Maybe this is an obsession. Yeah.
I think it's an obsession, for anybody that's into alcohol. Otherwise, why the heck are you doing it, really?
Yeah. So. I totally agree. I think there's so many aspects of it to be obsessed over, whether it's spirits or wine and then each individual category of those, and you can dive as deep as you want. So let's fast forward, and you can give me the short version. So start working in this winery, and then now you've got the Cru Podcast. How did those things sort of come to fruition?
Yeah. So working at the winery from not knowing anything, I think I worked there for about 2 years. And North Carolina, first off, as everybody knows, is not known for wine at all. There are quite a few people making wine throughout the state, and some of it's pretty good. A lot of it's really terrible. But the interesting aspect within that is that in the university that I went to, there were a few people starting a fermentation science department. So there was a program already that you could have as part of a chemistry major, but they wanted. So unbeknownst to me, the winery that I was working at was actually the kind of test research vineyard and winery for the university. So randomly, these people would come out, and the winemaker introduced me to a guy named Dr. Seth Cohen, and he was the chair of, which is now the department. He's the chair of the program and department of fermentation science. And so I think about 6 or 8 months in or so, Dylan, the head winemaker, he was like, "Hey, you should talk to Seth about, taking some of his classes and learning from him if you want to learn more, because you're really interested, and all this stuff." So I was like, yeah, sure, I guess. I didn't really know, because I was like, chemistry, microbiology, calculus, stats, like math and science are not my forte at all, at all. So I was really hesitant to actually do it. But then Seth was like, "No, take this intro class. It's not math, it's not science, not all this stuff. It tells you about wine and everything else." So I was like, all right, I'll do it. And at the time I was studying kind of a combination between environmental anthropology and sustainable development. So that naturally, fermentation science, it fit into it. And so I took that class, and from there I was pretty much hooked. And so I didn't want to switch my major altogether. So I concentrated in sustainable development with a concentration in fermentation science. And from there, it just kept growing. And so I would, be working with Seth and, the other assistant professors and whatnot out of the vineyard and the winery. And then the next day in class, we'd be talking about something that we just did at the vineyard and winery. So it was that nice duplicity, I guess, of the hands-on and the theoretical all together in one, which was really, really nice. And so from there, it just kept growing. And then I started taking WSET classes. I just kept buying bottles. And as we all do, we hear about something and we're like, whoa, there's this place in Australia called McLarenville. I need to get wine from there, or, whatever else it is. Or you're like, I've heard about Sonoma Pinot Noir. Oh crap, I can't afford that. Let's go somewhere else and find Pinot Noir. So I just kept doing that. And it kept growing. And at one point in time, I think it was like my junior year of college or senior year, I had the crazy idea of, well, why don't I buy a new bottle of wine every day? And that got really expensive really fast. So I stopped that after a week. But within that, the tangible aspect of working with wine and just the curiosity of it. I also studied business and marketing. And so I'd been just doing my own projects, little wine blogs and alcohol blogs and stuff like that. And so some friends of mine who also work in the hospitality industry, they're a pastry chef, he reached out and he was like, hey, I'm starting my own chocolate shop. I need a website. You've been building websites, can we do it? And so from there, that started a web design company and a marketing company, which I focused on food and beverage companies. And I found that was really great because I can make a lot more money a lot quicker working from anywhere, doing that, as opposed to, working 12 hours a day, slaving, in a winery or a vineyard, which I still love. But at the time, when you're a broke college student, money's great. So I did that. And from there, just kept doing other projects, building websites, got into digital marketing more, really got into podcasts, listening to Tim Ferriss, Lewis Howes, Tony Robbins, all these business guys. And I was like, a wine podcast would be really cool. Like, I know of one, like the Guild Somm podcast. I listen to it, every now and then, but it's kind of dry. It's all about, this new wine region, this style of wine, that type of stuff. And it's very informative and educational. That's awesome. But I'm a person that I love stories. And I love hearing about people. Growing up, I always loved reading biographies. And so I was like, well, that would be really cool. Plus, my end goal is to own vineyards and wineries one day. So that's a great way to talk to people who own vineyards and wineries, or they work in the industry some aspect. And I have all these questions that I want to ask and have answered. So why don't I start a podcast to do that? And it's cheap and it's easy. So why not? So I started it, and guests just kept saying, yeah, I'll come on. I would email people. I think one of the first people that I asked to come on was John Capon. I don't know if he's a billionaire, but he's a multi-millionaire, owner of Acker Merrill Condit, auction house, wine shop. And he's like, yeah, you can come on. I'll chat with you for an hour and record it. That's great. And it just kept going from there. So having that initial, I guess success, you could say, of, oh crap, somebody like John Capon's going to take the time to chat with me for an hour. Well, let's see if I can get this person to come on and see if they want to. And it just kept going from there. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And now I've moved from North Carolina. I live in England. My whole family's from England. Yeah, that's about it.
That's cool. It sounds like, you got a couple big wins early, like in starting out, like particularly like the winery, like you said, hey, do you have an intern? They said yes. Like, okay, great. Then you show up and they give you a room full of bottles and they're like, label these. And you're like, okay, great. I like it. And then you start a podcast, you reach out to John Capon and he's like, yeah, I'll do it. Totally. To get like a little deeper, do you think, what's your philosophy behind that? Do you feel like you make your own luck? Do you feel like you've just been right place, right time with the winery, the fermentation, science program opening up? How do you feel about how everything's come together so far for you?
So something that I've noticed with everything that I do, whether it's, trying to work the winery, start a podcast, get a job somewhere, whatever it is that I don't research it to the point of analysis paralysis or paralysis analysis. That's a killer, I think. And so if you look back at the, getting a job at the winery, starting the podcast, in there I worked at a real estate company, starting to build websites, all this stuff. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. It's literally just naivete, just saying, hey, I want to do this. I know this is my end goal, what I want it to look like. So let's try it. And there wasn't like, oh, well, this person's doing it this way. This person's doing it this way. This is this, yada, yada, yada. All right, this is how I have to do it. That's scary. Oh, I need a massive studio to do this. I have to be on the radio, all this stuff. This is going to cost a lot of money. I was like, no, like I'll sit in my living room with this mic. Literally, it started with these Apple headphones and my computer talking to people over Skype. And that was it. And so I think it's just naivete and just being willing to put yourself out there and not say, well, there's all these barriers to entry. Well, there could be, but these days there isn't. And somebody so somebody early on I talked to in college, and we got along well. He has his own business and whatnot. And a thing he likes to say a lot is, you don't get what you don't ask for. And it's so freaking true. I mean, the number of times that I've gone up to somebody or emailed somebody or whatever else, and just asked for what I wanted, like, most people are willing to somewhat accommodate, whether that's just giving it to you or just saying yes or working with you some aspect. But it's the willingness to actually ask and try, as opposed to any sort of luck or willing to that fate happens or something like that. It's just naivete and saying, try it. Let's see what happens.
I totally agree with that sentiment. I think so many people are afraid to ask. And even like just for an internship, right? Like I started part-time in a wine shop, and, I threw in an application and just sort of hoped that they'd pick me. Right. But, I think a lot of people just spend time daydreaming, like, oh man, it would be really cool to work in a wine shop. Oh, I'd really like that. And it would be nice. And they leave it there. So just like taking that step of like, oh, calling them up, seeing if they're hiring, seeing if they want to take someone, because I had no experience whatsoever in wine. And, looking back, they really had no business hiring me. I had really no retail experience whatsoever. I just had passion. But
I think that goes a long way as well, is just being genuinely curious, and people can tell. We can sense it. Like, if I can curse, people have a no bullshit filter. Mm-hmm. They really do. And if you're taking a genuine interest in something, the people are so much more willing to just work with you on anything.
For sure. And I think if you've got that passion, right, things that, like, when you're talking about labeling the bottles, same thing, stacking cases of wine in a warehouse, there's a lot of people who be like, okay, I'm out. This isn't boring for me. Yeah. But there's something satisfying about that aspect of like, okay, I just put 200 cases away and they're not going to topple over. This is great. Yeah. I'm sure like when you saw all the pallets were full and labeled, you're like, that satisfaction of just
absolutely
of seeing what you do. And I know you mentioned that you did website design. That's sort of where I came from prior to entering the wine world. And when you're in marketing, like there isn't really a lot of that satisfaction of like, mm-hmm. oh, here's what I did, which is sort of the great thing about wine. I feel like at the end of the day, there's some sort of creation aspect to wine that I can't put my finger on totally, but whether you're actually creating the product or you're involved in it somehow, if you're presenting wine for a dinner as a sommelier or doing something like that, there's some sort of creativity that's required and necessary to make it, magic.
Yeah. I think that within wine, no matter what level or aspect you're working with it, there's a story to it. But then also the tangible aspect. So if you're a winemaker, that's extremely tangible. You're taking something from the ground and making it into a product that you can then sell. But you can also then go enjoy it with your family and friends. And then there's the marketing aspect and all that other stuff. But even if you're like in wine retail or just in wine marketing or PR or something like that, there's still so many stories within that. And the great thing about it is, say you have a PR company or you work at a PR company and your clients are a restaurant, you're probably at some point in time going to go have dinner with them. You're going to have wine. It's experiential. And I think that's the biggest thing that sets the wine industry apart, is that it's experiential. Is that there's so many different facets. Finance is awesome. You stare at a screen full of numbers all day. Like, that's great. And you may have a ton of money in your bank account, but that money doesn't necessarily translate to this nice tangible thing that you can have all the time. So I think that's part of the allure to a lot of people.
Sure. I totally agree. It's one of the things that got its hooks in me. You were talking about stories in wine. And that's sort of the focus, I think the overriding theme of the Cru Podcast. What are maybe some of your favorite stories, your favorite podcast guests?
That's hard to say because they're all so different. I think two that stand out are Andre Mack was interesting. He's just a guy from, I think he's from Philadelphia or something, or Pittsburgh. Got into wine because he watched Frasier, and like super random. Worked at like Red Lobster, figured out, okay, I can make a ton more money if I sell wine instead of just food. And started doing that. Took one somm class. It was like, yep, that's not for me. I'm just going to study on my own. Kept studying on his own. Became, the wine director for Thomas Keller and the French Laundry and Per Se. Opened up Per Se in New York. And now he has his wine company, Mouton Noir. And he's just crazy successful. He's great friends with Gary Vaynerchuk and all these amazing people. But his story is just, I know what I want and I'm going to go get it. And that's it. And he just has such a passion for it as well. And he's willing to talk to anybody about it and give his time and energy. I think we spoke for like 2 hours or something. And I thought he would maybe chat with me for 20 minutes. So people like him, but then also just young people getting into it. Had a recent podcast episode with Rachel Solkowski of Racy Wines, and she's also the assistant winemaker at Loring Wine Company in Lompoc in California. And just how she approaches making wine for her own company is really interesting. And not only making wine, but the labels, the name, everything that goes into it. It's, when you think of an authentic company, like that's it. Because it's her, a few barrels, some grapes, and then she makes these wine or the labels and stuff herself and all this stuff. And it's just, there's a story to every aspect. And you can tell she really, really cares, because she's saved some wine, on her third vintage. She's actually been able to save a little bit, not only to age, but she's actually using that wine now to raise funds for like women's shelters in LA and all these things. So there's just this authenticity to her, and her wines are good. And, the important part, but yeah, it's just this authenticity that just comes out in every aspect of her company and who she is and what she does. That I think is really interesting. And I think she's just going to get really big. People are going to pick up on her wines soon. She's going to take off for sure. So those are two that are really good.
Yeah, those are great. I'll make sure I link to those in the show notes so people can get quick access to those. Yeah. And I'll check them out too. So let's talk a little more about the Cru Podcast and maybe some of the details behind it.
Yeah.
First, what's some of the biggest challenges you've had? It sounds like, you started lean and you're like, I'm just going to get a microphone and go. You're able to land big guests early. So what are some of the other things that you confront that are like, oh man, I never thought about this when I started a podcast?
Yeah. The two biggest things are internet connection and audio quality. So anybody that does video or podcasts or anything like that, those are the biggest. And the reason why is because pretty much all my guests are all over the world. Literally anywhere from Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia to LA, San Francisco, everywhere in between, London and whatnot. I live in Bristol, England. Like, it's 2 hours west of London. There's a little bit of wine culture here, not a ton. Nobody's super influential. And it's kind of nowhere. It's right in the middle of the world, really. And there's not much around it as far as wine. And so talking to those people and getting a connection with them and understanding I don't have deep pockets, so I can't go get on a plane every week and go talk to these people and do an in-person interview. But I still want to provide them value and learn from them. How do I do that? Well, just call them up like this and just chat with them that way. But everybody's in so many different places that the internet connection isn't always reliable. So And I'll give you an example of this. So I had an interview with Richard Betts, Master Sommelier, and he was in Denver in a hotel room, which was fine. Totally great. Usually that works perfectly fine. For some reason, it didn't, and it kept cutting out, and the audio itself just kept going up and down, and it was loud, and it was quiet, and you couldn't hear him, and all these things. And it was so bad that I just couldn't publish the episode itself. So from there, I adapted, and I was like, well, there's a little bit in there that I can take, that I can transcribe. It's not good enough to publish audio-wise, but the words are there, and I can publish that as, a written interview article. And so those things are what are fitting and really hard to come by, because a lot of it, other than just going to meet with a person face to face and chat with them, there's not a lot you can do when it comes to control. So it's frustrating that it's out of your hands. So yeah, those are the two biggest challenges. But otherwise, it's been really, I don't want to say easy to get, people on the show, but people in the wine industry are so willing to chat and just talk with you and educate and learn, just willing to help, that I found just about everybody that I reach out to, no matter what level they're at, they're excited and they want to say, yeah, I want to talk to you about wine for an hour.
Yeah. And I think I totally agree. And if you have some a genuine connection, and I mean, it's really easy in our industry, right? It's wine. So like at the end of the day, you both love wine.
Exactly.
So that makes it really easy. I imagine, trying to do a podcast in like marketing or technology or one of those fields has got to be impossible, right? Because it's so oversaturated with just people trying to do exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about like the next wave of podcasts and like the next generation of blogs, because I think people will start getting deeper. There's like a lot of like surface level stuff. I think right now everyone's doing stuff like, hey, I love wine, this is cool. But people aren't necessarily like focused on individual aspects. Like I think I've mentioned it in interviews before. Like I want to read the soil blog, or if it's out there, someone just needs to point me to it and say like, here it is. Here's the guy who's writing about all this geeky soil stuff and getting really deep and talking about it. So yeah, I think there's go ahead.
Well, I think there's also, and this is something that I've thought about and talked to some of the guests about, is the social aspect. So from a marketing standpoint, culturally, socially, some professional wine writers, they want to write stuff that needs to be written and published in some magazines. But the magazines won't publish them, obviously, because it's, not necessarily damning, but not the best promotion for them. So I think there's an aspect of honesty and transparency that's still to come, which I think is interesting. But then also something that I've been curious about is I have never heard any talk about alcoholism when it comes to people within, whether the wine industry, food and beverage, at all. Because I think there's a lot of people in the wine industry have addictive personalities, and they are go-getters and they're hustlers, and they but they also really love wine. And a lot of them drink, half bottle, maybe 2 bottles a day or whatever it is. Not from a standpoint that they're drunks or alcoholics, but that it's part of their job. And so I want to know if is there some sort of alcoholic aspect to how some people work and live? Not from a bad standpoint, just I think it's an interesting topic that nobody's really explored. And I don't know how to approach that whatsoever, other than saying, how much do you drink every day? Or do you consider yourself an alcoholic, which is weird. But I think there's something there from a social cultural standpoint that we should explore more. So,
yeah, it would be a little disarming to put your guests in that spot, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I don't plan on doing it, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore for sure.
Yeah. And I think if someone came at it with the right angle of like science and sort of understanding the mechanism, I mean, listen, we just touched on the idea that at 12 or 13 years old, I had martini books and shakers. You know, where does that come from? That would be fascinating. Sort of like this, you know, are we in the wine industry wired a different way? Maybe, maybe we share some things with people who, you know, suffer from alcoholism, or, you know, maybe there's like a, that would be awesome to see like some kind of like brain scans or things like that, or scientific studies. Totally.
Yeah, I think that'd be really, really interesting and beneficial to a lot of people. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. We'll switch gears a little bit from that, because I don't really know where to jump off from that that topic. But, you know, for people who want to be like wine experts, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is dispel that term, right? Because it's pretty loaded and it's total BS. Because I mean, who's really deciding who's a wine expert? For people who are like seeking that out, you know, like to learn more about wine and become, you know, savvy consumers and not be intimidated by a wine list, what advice do you have for them?
The best thing that anybody can do is learn. And so I by no means consider myself a wine expert whatsoever. I learn stuff about wine every single day. And that's part of the beauty of wine, is that it is so complex, it's so vast that you will never stop learning. Even if you become master sommelier or master of wine or whatever else, you know, Albert de Villon, who owns DRC, he learns something about wine every day. So there's that to first off understand that wine is inconquerable, I think. But the best thing to do is learn. So that comes to the question of, well, how do you actually approach learning this subject that you can never know everything about? And I was talking to Richard Betts about this, and he was saying that the best way is you have to understand, when it comes to tasting, is context. So a lot of people, especially younger people, they want to get into wine and they want to say, I want to try this new natural wine. This is really cool. Orange wines are awesome. Skin contact, no sulfur, saying all these cool things. They're like, get this wine. It's awesome. So good. It's from this person, this tiny producer, all this stuff, which is great. And I love that they're passionate about it. But you have to think about, okay, is this actually a good wine? Because there's a lot of wine out there that is not good. In fact, a lot of it's vinegar and a lot of it's crap. Not saying that the people are bad, anything like that, but it's the understanding the context of what is good and what isn't. And what's good for a region, a grape variety, a country, everything else. What does Grand Cru mean? What does Premier Cru mean? What is a village wine? What are those levels? And to understand that is really, really difficult. And so what Richard was telling me is that you need to start with the classics. You need to start with the people and places that have been around for hundreds of years. So France, you need to start with, not saying start with Bordeaux and Burgundy, because that's a big jump, but, you know, learn about Bordeaux, Burgundy, Rhone, Loire, learn about Italy, learn about Tuscany, learn about Germany and what they do, and all the old world, and then start to approach the new world. And then from there you can say, okay, this is actually a decent wine. This makes sense because this is this varietal, which is, you know, a French varietal that's originally planted in Bordeaux or Burgundy, and this is how they've been doing it for hundreds of years, and this is kind of the truest expression of it. So what's that point? Where is this wine? How does that land against that point? Not saying that, you know, Bordeaux or Burgundy are the best, but it's understanding the context of what is good, what is bad, what's a great expression of wine, and what's not. So that's from a tasting standpoint. But then there's a lot of theory in wine, which you need to know. And I am very much a visual learner. So I will take WSET classes, but the people that, take the book afterwards and read it 10 times through, I praise them, because I can't do that whatsoever. I literally have the Oxford Wine Dictionary sitting right here, and I haven't opened it yet because it's like a 500-page book, if not more, and it's just daunting, So I'd much rather watch videos, listen to podcasts, or read books that are about stories. So one book that I find very, influential to me personally is Kermit Lynch's Adventures on the Wine Route. So it's a classic book, but it's all about stories and his travels and his adventure. And I can't tell you how many times I've read a chapter of that book, and literally the next week, that domain, that person, this place comes up in conversation. I'll tell you one story. I was reading about Master Domes Gassac in the Languedoc in that book. Literally the next week, I go to the Real Wine Fair in London, and one of the first tables I see is them. I'm like, holy shit, that's so cool. So there's this book that's from the 80s, maybe the late 70s, I don't remember. But then there's this winery that's old, from the late 80s, when it started, or early 80s or something. And here they are. I can actually go taste those wines and see what he was talking about in that book. And then from there, I start talking with the winemaker. The winemaker happens to be the founder's son. He's now the CEO of the company. And then literally this morning, like 4 hours ago, I just had a podcast interview with him. Like, how random is that?
Yeah.
And that's all from reading this book and understanding and saying, oh, there's this name. This guy sounds pretty cool, and what they're doing is really interesting. They started planting Cabernet Sauvignon in the Languedoc when everything else was Grenache, Syrah, and Carignan. That's really cool. And then you have a real life example of it. So I think reading, even though I read very slow, is really important. But reading those stories and the adventures and the travels of other people, because that's where they talk about these places and these people that they meet and see. Whereas if you're reading a book that's very much meant to teach, and more an academic book, that's great, but I don't know how much you're going to learn on top of the real life examples. And having that academic background is amazing. You have to have it. But I think there's something on a deeper level that teaches us more, learning from stories. So
yeah, I think there's something way more memorable learning from stories, and to your point, like sort of chasing down the stories that you're interested in.
Yeah.
I mean, I think my first story that I was like trying to discover is like, okay, what is the difference between Bordeaux and Burgundy and their classification system? I think that was like the first thing I struggled with. And I was like, I remember just being so overwhelmed and like reading it, and I had no context, and it probably took months of just like,
yeah.
And then I had to come back to it again, like after learning more about just the wine world in general. Then I was like, oh, this is starting to make some sense. But it was just one of those things. I encountered it early on, but it set off a light bulb. Like, okay, what is this, and why do they do it? And I wasn't fazed by it. Thank God. I probably would have abandoned it.
I'm sure a lot of people do at that point.
Yeah, without the passion for it.
Yeah, but wine is one of those things that it is so complex, and there's so many pieces to it that you have to have this tangible aspect that you can reflect on. And, if you're reading about red grape varieties, how many thousands of red grape varieties are there? If you're reading about, okay, this is Cab, this is what it's supposed to taste like, this is Syrah, this is what it's supposed to taste like, unless you actually go to a vineyard to taste them, it doesn't make sense. If you read that, when you go taste a glass of wine, maybe you can translate it and be like, all right, that's probably Cabernet. But if you have that, memory and that experience of going to a vineyard, tasting Cabernet grapes off the vine, and then going into a winery and tasting Cab out of a barrel, next time you taste Cab, you're going to be like, yeah, that's Cab. Like, it's going to be like that. And I mean, personally, I think going to pick grapes off of a vine and go taste wine out of a barrel is a much more fun way to learn than sitting reading a book. So, which obviously I understand is difficult for a lot of people. I live in a place where there aren't a lot of vineyards at all, or a lot of wineries. So that can be hard. But the more you can do that, the better off you'll be, and the quicker you'll learn about wine as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And like the layers of context, right? Like there is, to your point, there is theory, right? There's certain things you just got to know.
Yep.
And there's no real way around that. It's just things it's like any subject in school, right? Like here is the foundation, here are the basics. Like everyone's got to know these to sort of get along, speak the same language. We're all talking about the same subject, and in the same way. And then from there, you can kind of dive off into different aspects. And,
right.
It's tough. I was just thinking about, I'm like, what is the best comparison, for a school subject? I was a foreign language teacher. I taught Spanish.
Okay.
I think that's probably close, just because there is such a barrier to entry of like, oh, I don't know any of these words, what they mean.
Right. And it comes back to that thing. So I think that's a great example is when you're sitting, I studied Spanish for 4 years and I can barely speak any of it. But I guarantee you, if I went to Costa Rica when I was in college for 10 days and I came back and I couldn't stop speaking Spanish because it just became second nature. So there's that experiential aspect of, all right, if you are immersed in something, even if it's for a couple hours, you're going to learn more than just sitting in a classroom or, staring at a book. That's just how our brain works.
So let's switch gears again.
Yeah.
What are you drinking, sipping on these days that's really enjoyable?
So that's always a hard question for a lot of people, because I feel like you open something new and you're like, holy crap, this is the best thing I've ever had. And then like the next day you open something else, you're like, this is so much better. But lately I've been on a white wine kick, whether that is Chablis or some sort of Chardonnay, or sparkling is really interesting right now, especially living in England. There's a lot of English sparkling coming out. And within that, not a lot. There are a few producers making 100% Pinot Meunier sparkling. Obviously, that's not a white wine, but they're making rosé from Pinot Meunier sparkling, and it's really, really good. So I think that's fascinating right now. There's a vineyard and winery called Exton Park in, I think, Hampshire in England. They're making a really interesting 100% Pinot Meunier sparkling rosé. And then for some reason, I really love Syrah and Grenache and Carignan and all those grapes. So there is a producer called Malaparte Wines in central Spain. They make a wine called Pico Lunar, which is 100% Syrah, and it's cheap and it is insanely good. I haven't had a ton of Syrah. I'm not going to say it's Hermitage or anything like that, but it's really good. It's a nice, complex wine. It's easy to drink at the same time. It has, these nice soft tannins, fruit, earth, wood, all this stuff. It's a really great all-around wine. I wish I had more bottles of it. I only bought one when I was in Spain. But that one was really, really good. And then another domain that's really good is, which you can find in the US, fairly easy, is Domaine Matassa. So this is a guy, Tom Lube. I think he's South African, or no, he's New Zealand, something like that. But from one of those places, went to the other to work, learn how to make wine, and now has a winery, Domaine Matassa, in Roussillon in France. And he's making some really, really good Grenache, Carignan, all those types of lighter red grapes. And his wines, one of them, I don't remember the exact name of it, it literally tastes like you're drinking cherry Coke, and it's freaking amazing. It's so good. Like I literally drank the whole bottle in like an hour. Didn't even realize it. And put it in the fridge 15, 20 minutes. It's a little cold, and it's perfect. It's so good. So
yeah, there's something to be said for like that nostalgic factor. You know, I've seen it in some wines recently. Like I just had not that long ago, Yalma's sparkling Chenin Blanc, or their Chenin Pet Nat. And to me, that was like adult lemon head. Like it was just, I was I wanted to be on a backyard, like somewhere, just like laying in the grass. Like it was just, it tasted like summer. And there's something we said for something that's nostalgic and like just makes you smile. Right. Like, how do you put a price on that?
Right.
So, and I think, go ahead.
Well, I think that's something, you know, you mentioned in there, the nostalgic, and that's fun to drink. And I think a lot of people, especially starting out, and this is something that I heard in my fermentation science classes a lot, which put a lot of people off of wine, is that there's an air around wine. And there's a snootiness and stuffiness, which is true. There is. But people forget, especially starting out, that wine's meant to be consumed. It is a drink just like water or beer or whiskey or whatever else. You know, it's meant to be consumed and to have fun with. And it goes great with food as well. So if you remember that as a starting point, I think that will kind of give you the confidence to ask those questions that need to be asked to learn more too. So anyways, that was kind of a digression, but.
No, I think that's a great point. I think all too often when we get caught up, especially in like the studying and learning aspect, you sometimes lose sight of like why you got in it. And it's because it's fun. Like it makes you happy. You have great memories surrounding it. You know, and it doesn't have to be because it was like this epic bottle. You know, it's just the social aspect, you know, like a lot of, like for me, wine was always related to like holidays, parties. That was really the only time wine came out in my family. So like, to me, it's always been celebratory and special, even though it wasn't, you know, like, oh, look at this, you know, first growth Bordeaux we're pulling out for Christmas. You know, it was just wine on the table. So, and I found wines too that remind me of like, oh, this reminds me of like the first time I tasted wine, you know? And it was like, oh, like that's again to that nostalgic factor. Like, oh, I really can't place, you know, anything else about this wine other than like it tastes familiar, and that's comforting to me, which is cool.
Yeah. And that's something that I spoke to Marissa Ross about, is how she describes wine. She writes about wine on her own blog, but how she describes wine is experiential based. So not saying, wow, this wine tastes like peaches and stone fruit and apricot and all this stuff. She's saying this wine reminds me of this picture, and it, you know, takes me there to the 60s when this picture was taken, and all this stuff. It's saying this reminds me of this, or this makes me want to be on the beach eating oysters with this bottle of sparkling in Southern California or something. You know, that is a great way to remember how a wine tastes, or how a wine could taste. So if you're thinking, well, there's this Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, what's that going to taste like? Well, match that to an experience. Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand, that'd be really good sitting on the beach in Hawaii, or sitting on the beach in Florida, or whatever else, because there's those tropical fruits. You know, it can be like coconut and pineapple and papaya and mango and all these things. So that makes sense. So if you actually look at a wine itself and what's supposed to be in there, and then you match that to an experience, it's going to be pretty similar. Everything that coincides together. So it's kind of a weird way to think of it, but
no, I think, you know, all too often, again, it's like that technical side. Like we get, you know, if you start, you know, doing any like WSET, or you go through the court, you know, you get to the tasting grid and you're like looking for these certain aspects, and you lose sight of, you know, like you're trying to check boxes and be like, which fruits and it, you know, is there oak, you know, how much, and you're just doing that instead of, sort of thinking like, okay, what is really going on here, and finding like that harmony in the wine is probably a way better way to taste for people just starting out. Is like, okay, visualize yourself somewhere, like where does this wine take you to, and don't worry so much about like, is it, you know, yellow apple or green apple.
Right. I can't tell the difference. It's an apple. It's an apple. Like, come on.
Yeah. And the first, like a similar analogy, the first time I ever heard it was Cal Fussman in his article, Windows on the World, or Cocktails Before the Collapse, where he was working at Windows on the World at One World Trade Center. He talked about, like, it was the moment it gelled for him was wine and music, right? And like when he drank wine, he heard this music.
Yep.
And there's another profound analogy, right? Because music's so individual, I think, that it, it's just from one person to the next, like, but we can all sort of agree, like, that's a really great song, like the classics. To your point, you're like, oh, you got to know the classics, right? So if you go back and you do whether it's your blues, your rock, even your Beethoven, right? Like, you got to know that stuff to appreciate these other things.
For sure. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And, there's that core group that everybody should know. And within that, you can say, well, yeah, okay, Green Day is good because it makes sense of this. But also you can look at it just like music. You can see the influences, where it comes from. If you understand what Tuscany tastes like, and then you have Sangiovese from, I don't know, Argentina. I don't even know if Argentina makes Sangiovese. But if they did, you could say, okay, I can see where that comes from. I can see the influence there. That makes sense. And helps you taste with it too.
Yeah, so true. And I think working in wine retail, I feel like wine retail as it exists today is sort of like the death rattle of the record store. You had a bunch of people who loved what they did, loved music, or in this case, loved wine, had probably like a corner of the store that they knew really well and like that they were their favorites, but they could appreciate everything. But if someone came in and asked for like a top 40, hit, like everyone would scoff at them and be like, like, come on, you can't be drinking that. Like, go down the street, go to the big chain or the supermarket. It's totally reminiscent of that. I should probably write an article about, all the comparisons.
Yeah. I think that's really sad. And that is that's a barrier for a lot of people.
Sure.
Because, and it's the same with like coffee or chocolate or whiskey or anything else, in this artisan craft kind of movement, is there are people that you will approach them and want to learn more, and you will be curious, and they will kind of say, not necessarily directly, but they will say, you don't know about this? They're like, you don't know what? It's like, who cares? Right. Like, the thing is, wine's meant to be enjoyed. So enjoy it. And if you need to learn about it, go ask somebody that's not going to be a dick when you say, I don't know anything about the Loire Valley. Could you tell me about it? Or what's a great wine to have with Indian food? That's a hard one. Okay, well, try this. There are people out there, and there's a coffee shop in Bristol that it's kind of has this reputation of being the pompous one. They have really good coffee, but it is, when you walk in, it's kind of uncomfortable. And there are wine shops like that, unfortunately. Yeah. But there are also a lot of wine shops that you walk in and they just want to teach you more and more. Probably to the point where it's overload. But, there are a lot of people out there, and it's kind of sad that there are people like that. But that's life, I guess.
Yeah. I think, my MO is always, when I'm working, is like, if you drink wine, you're my friend. So like automatically we start on that basis. And then, it's about finding what people want. I'm lucky I work in a shop where there's no commission. So there's no incentive for us to be like, oh, hey, come on over here and check out this stuff. But the great part is someone comes in, they're like, oh, I really like this. And then you can show them where it is. And then you're like, well, have you tried this? Have you ever had this before? And you just create a conversation about it. And some people, they're transactional. They want to drink the same thing every night. And you know what? More power to them. They know what they like. That's an awesome thing. And then some people, you just start talking to them and they're like, oh, no, I never had that. Or, oh, I only drink California Pinot Noir. I've never had, anything from the Willamette. And like,
Right.
oh, we'll try this. This is really good. It's, closer to that California style. And like, we'll give you an introduction into what it's all about. And you're like, okay, and then they walk out of there. And, like, to me, the thrilling aspect is when they come back and they're like, I had that and it was really, really good. And I loved it. Tell me more.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
And I have friends that, they own wine shops, or they work in wine shops, and they'll say, or they'll post something on Instagram and it's like, oh, I just got this wine in and it's really cool. It's this, and this. And then you'll see them at a trade show or something, or you'll see them at your local wine shop and you try it. And then you can, message your friend and be like, that was so freaking good. Like, thanks for telling me about it. It gets everybody excited. So. Yeah.
And I think that's, you're touching on one of those things that I haven't been quite able to articulate, but I'll try. Is sort of this idea, right? In wine, like wherever you start or wherever you are, like you're always going to be influenced by someone else, which is like a weird thing, like you're going to hear about it somewhere else. There's not like with music, at least, like maybe Spotify will put like a random song in your playlist and it's an algorithm deciding. Like there's no computers or anything else. Like there's human intervention in wine in a lot of different aspects, right? So like you're going to find out about wine by reading someone's book, reading someone's blog, talking to someone at a wine shop. And I think so many people want to be like, I'm discovering all this stuff and, I'm the expert, and it's such crap, like you're always going to be influenced. Someone's making the wine, for crying out loud, right? Like unless you're alone on an island making wine for yourself, like this is about community. This is about connection. This is about celebration. It's a fun thing. So I think so many people want to be just focused on the narrow, when in actuality, you should be doing the exact opposite.
Absolutely. For sure. If you look at the newish trend in the US, which is wine clubs, you'll read their marketing language. A lot of them will say, we're not the wine club that makes you take this palate test and say, well, if you like your coffee like this, then you like this type of wine. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I think it's to your point of wine's, human interaction, and how you learn what somebody could potentially like is by listening to them, not by saying, oh, well, you like coffee like this. Okay, then you'll like this wine. Great. Sometimes I love a latte. Sometimes I love filter coffee. Sometimes I love an Americano. It just depends. And so people are trying to bring tech and automate and bring algorithms into wine. And there are instances where it could work. But wine's still personal. It's still people to people. And if you look at the wine industry and how wine is marketed, for 80%, it's people to people. And that's just how it is. I mean, back to Andre Mack. He literally gets on a plane every day and goes and sells his wine, people to people. And he has like 30,000 followers on Twitter. He's still going out to wine shops and selling his wine. Because that's how it's done. People want to taste it. They want to try it. They want to hear the story from you. Whether that's the winemaker, the shop owner, or whoever else. It's, what's your experience with this wine? How can you relate it to me? And how will I enjoy it? And an algorithm just won't tell you that.
Yeah, it's very true. I totally agree. And I think it's one of those things that, while there may be a lot of parallels between wine retail and music retail, like there's no 99-cent download for wine. Well, at least not yet, right?
There will be now that you said it.
I know someone's going to watch this and come up with a way to get wine, into your, or maybe it'll be Google Glass, and it'll just be like a glass you can hold up and drink,
That'd be good.
Any wine for 99 cents a sip.
That would be really cool. I'd be totally down with that.
That sounds pretty great, actually. Someone will figure it out. I really think this is a perfect place to end. What's the best way people can get in touch with you?
Go to the website. So you can go to crupodcast.com, crupodcast.com. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, mainly Instagram. Handle is @Cru Podcast. But the best way to stay up to date with the podcast itself is go into your podcasting app on your phone or your iPad or in your car, and subscribe to the podcast from there. So either Apple Podcasts or Stitcher Radio or Overcast, Downcast, any of the cast apps, Google Play. You can find us in there, and subscribe and leave us a review if you like it.
Super. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today, Chappy. It was great talking to you.
Likewise.
And look forward to doing round 2 in the future.
For sure. Let's do it.
So round 2 ended up happening over coffee, as I said, in Sonoma. Maybe we'll be able to get round 3 live on tape one day. I should be heading out to California soon, and hopefully my paths will cross with Chappy again. If you'd like to cross paths with Chappy yourself, you can check out Cru Podcast. And as he so eloquently put it, subscribe via all the different casts that are out there. Furthermore, he is the wine director at Barn Diva in Healdsburg, California, which is an excellent spot, and I was happy to dine at while I was out there myself. Also, thanks to my podcast manager, Talia Goodman, for pushing me to publish, reminding me of deadlines, and making the podcast a priority. Thanks to Domain for sponsoring this episode of The Road to Wine Expert. Domain is the nation's largest network of wine storage facilities, but they don't just store wine. They can help you in every step of your journey as a wine collector. That means shipping, receiving, importing, organizing, selling, storing, and protecting. Speaking of protecting, Domain offers 2 amazing storage products, Domain cardboard boxes and VineBox, a stackable, flexible wine storage solution. For more information on both those products, you can go to domainstorage.com. They're also available for purchase on Amazon. And finally, thanks to all the musicians who allowed their music to be featured on this podcast by sharing it through the Creative Commons license. If you'd like to know more about these artists and where you can find their amazing music, you can go to roadtowinexpert.com/music. And if you're still here, there's a couple things that you can do to support the podcast. The first of which is visiting roadtowinexpert.com and signing up to receive our emails. That'll keep you in touch about what is happening on both the show and the blog. Also, leave us a review on your platform of choice. It's a great way to say thank you and help us discover more and more people and get on the trending lists and all that jazz. So your review is much appreciated. And last but not least, if you've got questions, comments, concerns, or just looking for advice in general, reach out to me at brian@roadtowinexpert.com. That's BRIAN @roadtowinexpert.com.